Our speaker today is Brad Leppert. Brad is an American archaeologist, best known for his work on ancient earthworks and Ice Age peoples in Ohio. Leppert is the curator of archaeology and manager of archaeology and natural history at the Ohio History Connection, where I work, and we're co-workers. So, Leppert is a native of Hudson, Ohio, and graduated from Hudson High School. He has continued to live in Ohio apart from his time at the University of New Mexico, where he received his bachelor's degree after transferring from the University of Akron. Leppert earned his MA and PhD degrees at The Ohio State University. I didn't go there, but I had to say the. Leppert began his career as a curator, at the Newark Earthworks and Flint Ridge Memorial State Park after interning with the Ohio Department of Transportation. He is known for the excavation of the Burning Tree Mastodon, which took place in December 1989, almost said 1899, during expansion of the Burning Tree Golf Course, and which eventually resulted in rethinking then current ideas about mastodon diets. The story made Discover Magazine's top 50 science stories in 1991. Leppert is also known for his incredible work on the Great Hopewell Road and Serpent Mound. The Newark Earthworks are the largest set of geometric enclosures and mounds in the world and are one of the 3 Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks sites seeking to be inscribed on the World Heritage List next month in September. The other 2 sites are located in Warren County, Fort Ancient, Ross County, Hopewell Culture Natural Historical Park. Those are the other 2. The work of the Hopewell people who lived in Ohio circa AD 1 to 400. These geometric earthworks covered nearly 5 square miles using more than 7 million cubic feet of earth, and Brad will correct me on all this research I did. And the big question, why did Hopewell build such monumental works? Well, this is the question that I know you're dying to hear, and this is why we brought the world's authority on the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks directly to you today. Without further ado, I bring you Brad Leppert.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Jaron. Thank you for all of you for inviting me here today. I'm very happy to talk about the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, and it looks like it's up, so I can get started. There we go. So this is kind of a tale of 8 sites, 8 enormous earthwork sites. And I want to run through the slides as quickly as I can without rushing, because I want to leave time for you to ask questions that then I will answer. So the whole point of listing sites on the World Heritage List is recognizing that these are places of outstanding universal value and should therefore form part of the common heritage of humankind. You all know many of the sites that are on the World Heritage List already. The Great Pyramid of Egypt, Machu Picchu, Stonehenge. And I think it's almost a no-brainer that these Hopewell earthworks, these ancient indigenous American Indian earthworks, also should be recognized. I want to diverge from the script here because Machu Picchu comes up in a book I very much enjoyed up until the very last part. It plays on a common joke about archaeologists that I'm an archaeologist, my career lies in ruins. And the book was called Careers in Ruins, and it was a very nice tribute to archaeologists. But at the very end, she's talking about being on a bus going to Machu Picchu with a bunch of other people that were talking about World Heritage. And one woman, a woman who I happen to know and work with, was going on and on about these earthworks in Ohio and how they were hoping to be nominated to the World Heritage List. And this author says, who cares about earthworks? They're just dirt. I mean, they're not stone. Why would anyone care? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And my only response was, the earthworks, the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, are piles of dirt in the same way that the Parthenon is a pile of rocks. And I hope to make that clear. So far, right now, there's 1,157 World Heritage Sites. And you can see that the United States doesn't have all that many compared to many countries that are even smaller. None in Ohio yet. We're hoping that'll change next month. The Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks nomination is a partnership between the Ohio History Connection and the National Park Service. And as Garen sort of already alluded to, we've got let's just kind of 8 separate earthwork sites. The Newark Earthworks, which is where I've been working almost my entire career, is the northernmost expression of these gigantic earthworks. And I'm biased, but I think it's one of the most remarkable and exceptional. The Fort Ancient Earthworks over in Warren County are the 2 Ohio History Connection sites. And then there are 5 sites that make up Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, 5 separate sites. There's a wonderful painting of what the Newark Earthworks may have looked like 2,000 years ago. These are the largest collection of geometric earthworks that the Hopewell culture built. Many of the examples in Chillicothe are also geometric earthworks, but they're not as well preserved and they weren't as monumental. The other kind of ceremonial earthwork the Hopewell built were hilltop enclosures. And you can see by the name, Fort Ancient Earthworks, early settlers in Ohio thought they were forts because they were hills surrounding hilltops. And they look quite a lot like fortifications, Iron Age fortifications in Europe, for example. But the ditches are inside the earthworks, and they were filled with water. So they were kind of sacred features. But these also, from work we've done, are also ceremonial places. They're not forts, in spite of the unfortunate name that has stuck for centuries or decades at least. So there's like 7 different criteria by which sites can be nominated as World Heritage Sites. And here's another sort of behind the scenes look. I'm reading these 7 criteria and I said, we could make all 7. We could do a grand slam home run. The folks from the Department of the Interior quickly disabused me of that notion. She said, no, you only need to make 1. You don't get extra points for meeting other criteria. It just means you have to make your document about 7 times as long. So I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So they recommended we pick 1 that we felt was strong and another as a backup in case there turned out to be any problems with it. So the criteria that we think these sites meet best are that they're masterpieces of human creative genius, and you won't have any question about that before you leave the room today, and that they're also unique or exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or civilization which is living or has disappeared. It's kind of awkward language, but it was an exceptional ancient indigenous American Indian civilization for a number of reasons. So I've got like 2 slides for each, and I could give you an hour-long presentation on each one. So we're going to try and do this quickly. They're masterpieces of creative genius because it's monumental architecture that uses and incorporates in its architecture precise geometry of a kind we probably wouldn't even have expected for this time period in America. The circle and octagon are all based on a sort of fundamental unit of measure. The diameter of that circle is 1,054 feet. And even in some of the other Hopewell sites in Chillicothe, they use that same unit of measure for diameters of circles or for sides of squares or half of that unit of measure for a diameter of a smaller circle. So very precise geometry. And just some examples of that in Newark. The area of that 1,054-foot diameter circle is equal to the area of the perfect square that's like a mile away from it. Now that's a geometrical conundrum called squaring the circle that my kids, when they were taking geometry, said, oh, Dad, you can't square the circle. And I don't know, because pi is a transcendental number or something, I don't know. But maybe you can't do it with an equation. But these people understood the concept, they were playing with it, and created incredibly big architecture to a very close approximation, demonstrating those principles. The perimeter of the square is equal to the perimeter of the great circle that's next to it. And I could go on with this, but it seems like each of these separate components of the Newark Earthworks has some hidden geometric connection with one of the other earthworks. The earthworks were tied together by these ceremonial passageways, these parallel walls, but they were also tied together by that underlying geometry. And also, they had an incredible knowledge of astronomy. They had been sky watchers for probably centuries. And they understood that the moon goes through a cycle very much like the sun. We all understand the solar cycle. There's the summer solstice, where the sun is rising at its northernmost point on the horizon, the equinox, which is its midpoint, and the winter solstice, when the sun is rising at its southernmost point. The moon does the same thing, but it does it every month. And that angle changes from month to month. At one end of this 18.6-year-long cycle, it has its maximum northern rise and southernmost rise. 9.3 years later, the northernmost rise of the moon is at its southernmost point, and the southernmost rise of the moon is at its northernmost point. So the angle is shorter. So that means you've got 4 points on the horizon that mark this cycle: the northernmost rise, the southernmost rise, the northern minimum, and the southern minimum. And then if you turn around, there are 8 points on the western horizon that mark the set points for that period. The Newark Earthworks include alignments to all 8 of those points on the horizon embedded in the architecture. And as that diagram or image on the right shows, the northernmost rise of the moon lines up to the major axis of the circle and octagon. So that must have been a really key date for the ceremonies that were to take place there. Also, the vast earthwood enclosures and monumental timber structures were places for ceremonial gatherings. That's why we call them ceremonial earthworks, because they were like indigenous cathedrals on a monumental scale. And when I say monumental, the diameter of that circle is 1,200 feet, and that's 4 American football fields end to end. And then testimony to this extraordinary civilization is its extent. Some of you will remember the advertising slogan that Ohio used to have, "Ohio, the heart of it all." 2,000 years ago, it was certainly the heart of it all. Ceremonial regalia made out of raw materials came to Ohio from literally the ends of their world. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the upper Great Lakes. And furthest west there, it's a black volcanic glass called obsidian. When that was first found back in the 1900s and late 1800s in Hopewell Mounds, people thought sure it was going to be Mexican obsidian. But every obsidian has its own chemical fingerprint. And Hopewell obsidian was traced to Yellowstone Park, obsidian cliffs in Yellowstone. And these spear points, you can't tell from that picture, they're like this big. So they're not any spear points that people actually used. I mean, they were made of glass. And we confirmed that recently with research that was funded by the Seneca tribe of New York. They did micro-wear evidence, looking with a microscope at all the edges of these, and they were never used. They were hafted on spears, but they were probably carried around in ceremonies before they were finally buried in the mounds as offerings. And to answer the question that Garen posed, is why did people do this? I think these earthworks were pilgrimage centers, that this was like Jerusalem or Mecca, and people were coming from the ends of their world, bringing these offerings, participating in the rituals and ceremonies, perhaps even participating in the building of the earthworks. So these earthworks then, and I think have the potential now, to connect people, the earth and the cosmos, across space and time. Now, what do we get out of World Heritage inscription? And for me, this is the most important one. We lift up ancient American Indian heritage. We help our indigenous tribal partners who no longer live in Ohio. Most of them are in Oklahoma. And we sort of restore them, their dignity, their pride in the achievements of their ancestors. So American Indian tribal nations reconnect to this ancestral land and tell their stories. Ohioans gain appreciation for the world-class heritage sites in our own backyard. So, and I think that's going to be one of the key things. When the world comes to Ohio, people in Ohio will recognize that we do have these amazing cultural treasures, and that the American Indian heritage of Ohio is an important part that should be celebrated. And then there are, of course, the economic benefits that many of us expect: tourism, cultural tourism. And the World Heritage Group and the Department of the Interior that we work with all say, yes, you can get a big infusion of tourists, but you have to prepare for it. Those tourists, especially the first wave, have to have positive experiences in the hotels and in the dining and in the other things that they encounter when they're here. And so if we're good hosts, that will end up resulting in a big increase in tourism potentially. And not just for the counties where the earthworks are. The other counties, like where the big airports are, like Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, those home bases where people will be arriving can be a part of this. So where are we in the process? The nomination was submitted in 2022. Of course, I leave out the 10 years before that when we were working on the nomination and working with partners to move this forward. World Heritage Committee will be considering our nomination next month. And myself and some colleagues are going to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia for the World Heritage Committee's meeting to be a part of that process and to answer any questions that they might have. And the big issues that we're dealing with now in terms of not just inscription, but post-inscription, increasing partnerships with tribal nations. These are, after all, their stories. And I have whole other presentations about how I know that's absolutely true, and how these tribes are the descendants of these people that lived in Ohio 2,000 years ago, and they have traditional knowledge that, like a Venn diagram, can encompass some of what we see in that 2,000-year-old record. Not all of it yet, but some, and I find that fascinating. The Octagon Earthworks, many of you know, is a golf course. Mound Builders Country Club is leasing it. And for a couple of years now, the Ohio History Connection has been involved with legal procedures to reclaim the lease so that we can become a World Heritage Site and so that we can have more public access to that site. That process is nearing its end. The valuation trial is in October, and that should be the last stage in our acquisition of the site. And now preparing sites to welcome international visitors from the world. And we don't think that's going to make a lot of changes. We are already good stewards of these sites, but we need to up our game and to welcome an international audience. I hope that's the last slide. Oh, how can you get involved? Sign up to be a friend of World Heritage Ohio, and you don't have to worry about the link, just search on World Heritage Ohio and you'll find it. Doing this inscription has cost us a lot of money. Flying a bunch of staff to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia is costing a lot of money, so donations are always appreciated. And visit these sites, experience them for yourself, and then spread the word, share your experiences with your friends. Because we don't want just people from other countries to come. We want our neighbors to come and know about these amazing sites. That's certainly my last slide. So hopefully I've left time for questions. Yes?
So today, what's the best way to experience these sites? What would be your recommendation?
Well, I'm trying to do this without biasing the Ohio History Connection sites, but I think going to the Great Circle in Newark is a really good place to start. I'm there the first Friday of every month at 12:30 to do a tour of the site. I wish I'd written the date down. We've got an upcoming Sunday open house at the Octagon Earthworks coming up this month. You can search that and find it. I'll be there. Others will be there giving guided tours. But I think it's really helpful to have a guided tour, to have an archaeologist, a knowledgeable person there, because it's a different kind of architecture. We work with John Hancock, who's an architectural historian retired at the University of Cincinnati. He says when he was in architecture school, he learned about 5 kinds of architecture. And he said the Hopewell earthworks are something else. There's something, he describes them as uncanny. Because of their scale, they're just enormous. And because unlike most of that other kind of architecture you saw that's made out of stone and goes up into the sky and makes a prominent stone monument, this is horizontal. And you can feel like, especially the Newark earthworks as it originally existed, encompassing 4.5 square miles, that would have been a bewildering labyrinth. And people were probably led through it in ceremonial processions. And perhaps not even comprehending the shapes that they were experiencing because they're so huge. And especially if you can come to the Octagon, because when you're in the middle of the Octagon, it's just so enormous. You can't really define it as an octagon. It's just this gigantic space. And the architecture is hard to comprehend without having somebody guide you through it. But then also Hopewell Culture National Historical Park at Mound City, their main building, their rangers, park rangers give tours on a daily basis. And Mound City is one of the most meticulously restored of these earthworks that focused on burials. So it's a sort of a rectangular enclosure with rounded corners that has a number of burial mounds. It's just crammed with burial mounds. So I think those are good places to start. Third on my list, I think, would be Fort Ancient, because it's got a great museum to orient you, but it's also huge. So, yes?
How did they communicate to have pilgrimage all over North America? And how did they build them? I know you said the
Geometry.
So historically, what did they use?
Okay, you got two questions there, and some of it I'm having to speculate on. But probably the geometry was just simply poles and ropes. And in the same way that you'd make a circle with a compass, sticking it in it and spinning the pencil around. I mean, they would put the rope in the ground or a pole in the ground and then swing an arc with the post. And then, as with the Great Circle, we think they built little mounds first to sort of mark out the area. So squares would be a little bit more difficult, but you can do that with a compass too. How they communicated, because certainly based on what we know about tribes today, if people were coming from Wyoming, they were not speaking the same language as the people that lived in Ohio. But one thing that I could only show you very briefly in that slide of the regalia from all these different regions, the symbolic vocabulary of this regalia is really amazing. There's mica hands, mica claws, copper ear spools, bear tooth, and other kinds of animals, mountain lion teeth, all kinds of things. And I think that kind of regalia, if the pilgrim is wearing that when they arrive at the site, people would say, oh, you're Bear Clan or whatever, and would be able to sort of guide them to people who could talk with them and help them go through the experience. So I think that's one of the reasons of the rich regalia that the Hopewell had and that we find in their mounds as offerings. Yes?
In Bethlehem we have two World Heritage sites, the Church of Nativity and the landscape near south of Jerusalem. And I was involved in the World Heritage Site designation of the South Jerusalem Hills. And one of the things that UNESCO required of us is to list the threats. So I was wondering, what are the threats for these hills in terms of potentially could damage them or could impact them, and how that could also relate to climate change or other things that might happen?
Yeah, since these are already protected by the Ohio History Connection and by the National Park Service, the list of threats really isn't that long, but we know many of the earthworks still have trees growing on them. They've been growing on them for hundreds of years, and those can become a threat if they fall over. They can rip up part of the earthwork with the root ball. So we're trying to develop plans to manage the trees and to monitor them, and if any of them look unhealthy, cut them down before they have a chance to fall. We also currently have a problem, particularly at the Octagon, where the earthworks are in trees. Groundhogs develop communities. And there's one wall at the Octagon that the country club has had trees growing on it to provide a screen from a residential community right on the other side of it. And it's like Groundhog Central. It's like a hotel for groundhogs. So we've got to find ways to manage that. And we've looked for strategies. And apparently if you hunt them and trap them, they just breed faster. It's just a response. So it's like, one good strategy that's been recommended is to have dogs patrolling, but that might have its own problems. So we're still looking for ways, and if anybody knows how to manage groundhog populations, we'll be looking for some help with that. But those are just a couple of them, but most of them are on that level. They're things that we hope can easily be managed. It's not like we have agreements with like the city of Newark and Heath not to build giant buildings next to the properties that would cause the view shed to be harmed. So yeah, we're working on those things, but that's a good point. So you know how hard we've been working for the past 10 years or something on this. Yes?
In Columbus, there's a mound street, and there was a mound apparently down by the river.
Yes.
That the early settlers destroyed. Do we know anything about it, and would that have been possibly part of the Hopewell culture?
It's possible, although mounds were built by different indigenous cultures over a great period of time for different reasons. The big conical mounds could be Hopewell, but they're more likely older, what would have been called the Adena culture, what we would have called the Adena culture. Those names, by the way, Adena and Hopewell, have nothing to do with ancient indigenous names. Those are names that archaeologists have applied so that we can talk about there was this culture, and then the culture that came after it was different in some ways, and so we have to give them names to be able to talk about them. But I do know that mound on Mound Street was, the clay from it was used in bricks for the first state house, apparently.
One more?
Yeah, one more, and then they're going to pull me out of here.
With Flint Ridge being so close to just being east of York, how much flint do you think came into that as a part of a trade with some of these other things?
Well, it's interesting because it did figure, but I don't think it was trade. Flint Ridge was absolutely the favorite flint, the signature flint of the Hopewell culture. And work that I've done up there, I mean, the Hopewell, unlike all the other peoples before and after, quarried flint on an industrial scale. And they were making two things. They were making little bladelets, sort of like replaceable razor blades, and triangular bifaces. And I think they were making those by the millions or something and taking them down to Newark and distributing them to the other sites. And I think those became pilgrims' tokens that were given as gifts to the pilgrims that came here, because we find smatterings of them, like down in Tennessee at Pinson Mounds of the same period. One of those mounds has like 6 Hopewell bladelets in it. And in one of the mounds at Newark that the Ohio Canal went through, there was like 20 bushels of mica, which comes from eastern Tennessee. So it's like, unless somebody said, oh, I'll trade you these 6 magic bladelets for those 20 bushels of mica, that doesn't sound like trade. And if you study pilgrimage on a cross-cultural basis, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, a common feature of the pilgrimage is when the pilgrim gets there, they get a token or a souvenir to take back with them. And they take back and they treasure that. They bring out that Flint Ridge flint bladelet to cut their daughter's wedding cake or something. Of course, that's a little facetious, but that kind of thing. They would bring it out on ceremonial occasions, and people would like, you've been to Newark? You've been to Chillicothe? You have a flint? Wow. So I think that explains why you get dribbles of Flint Ridge flint going out and mounds of these other special things coming in. All right. Well, I think I need to let you get on with your day.
I want to say real quick, I've been to hear
Brad speak up at Newark, and to walk around with him on that facility, on the site, it's almost a spiritual thing, the way he goes about it and the enthusiasm that he has. So it's really informative to go there and hear from him and walk the land. I mean, it's really an incredible experience.
So it's the first Friday of each month?
Yes.
And what time?
12:30.
12:30, great. Well, I will plan an outing for everybody. Thank you. We'll call it Fabulous Friday Fellowship, for those of you who remember those days. But thank you very much. Garen, you just hit it out of the ballpark with the last 2 speakers, but can't wait to listen to your tour, and maybe a possibility of one of our quarterly meetings that we have. We could also have a meeting over at the Ohio Connection. So thank you. Thank you very much.